Welcome back to our dig around, our exploration of the Bible book of Revelation. So good to have you with us. We're at the end of chapter 14, and today we are exploring verses 14 to 20, and this is what they say. I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Another angel came out of the temple of heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because the grapes are ripe." The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia. So with John's opening "I looked," we have reached the 6th section of this series of visions across chapter 12 all the way to the start of chapter 15. And in broad terms, that gives us an indication of what we're looking at here is what happens at the end of history. This is another camera angle on the same thing. We have the righteous and just judgment of God, just as we've seen with the 7 seals and the 7th trumpet. In this passage, we have 2 descriptions of the final judgment. Judgment of those who have rejected the message of the angel in the last video, chapter 14, verse 6, and have continued to live their lives against God and his Messiah, Jesus Christ, and therefore have worshipped the beast. The Son of Man seated on a cloud is another reference to Daniel chapter 7 in the Old Testament, which depicts the Son of Man coming to redeem and to judge, redemption having already occurred. Earlier on in Revelation 14, go and have a look at video 45 for that. And here we have the judgment aspect coming in. An angel comes from the temple. That means it's from God himself, with a message from God to the Son of Man, who is Jesus Christ, that the time for judgment has come. Here Jesus is shown with a crown on his head. He is the king over his people and over his enemies. And he is shown as being obedient to his Father, just as he was when he walked on this earth. The reaping of the harvest and the reaping of the grapes both function as metaphors for judgment on the wicked, those who worship the beast. They have a slightly different function. With the harvest, just as God determines the times and the seasons of the earth, and therefore of the harvest, so he determines the times and the seasons of the whole world, and therefore has determined that when the time is right for this final judgment, when the sins of humanity have reached their full measure. The grapes and trampling out the wine in the winepress draws on another Old Testament metaphor that is universally used to describe God's wrath against sin. We find the only other mention of a winepress in the book of Revelation in chapter 19, verse 15, which describes Jesus Christ's judgment on the evil nations. The bloodletting and the description of blood mounting up to horses' bridles and going on for 1,600 stadia, which is about 200 miles, are all present as figurative language to emphasize the severe nature of the judgment. All sin and evil will be dealt with. There will be consequences. This is no joke. There's no minimizing of God's wrath against sin and Satan and evil and all who perpetrate it. This is serious stuff here. This makes us feel uncomfortable, but we can't ignore this aspect of the gospel. Jesus spoke regularly about judgment in his earthly ministry as an aspect of the good news of his coming. The good news that Jesus Christ is the Son of God who died and rose again and offers forgiveness, freedom to all who come to him, who can receive it as a gift without cost, without price. This is wonderful news, but equally it's not forced. It's not commanded. It's not forced on anyone. It can be rejected. And if it's rejected, then there will be judgment, and it will be complete. And whilst it might not include a literal bloodletting, it will be such that those are the best words to describe what's going on. Our culture is a culture that seeks comfort at all costs, is repulsed by any kind of pain and suffering. Combined with sin, which, in the words of Christian author Mark Meynell, is living in God's world as if it was my own. In other words, it's the pride of believing that life revolves around me, revolves around yourself, me, the king of my own throne. Then we have a potent cocktail that calls the warnings of judgment themselves evil. But the gospel warns that judgment to come will come, and the warning itself is for the sake of the salvation of many. If you're a Christian watching this, then you need to take this seriously in your prayers for those who are not yet Christians. If you're not a Christian, if you don't know Jesus and you're watching this, then heed the warning. It is for your salvation. It is for your own sake. There is still time to come to Jesus Christ. His heart is his deepest desire is to rescue sinners from death and evil. But part of the message is that you can reject it, and there are consequences if you do. They're clear here in this passage of Revelation. So turn to Jesus before it's too late.